Welcome and thank you for joining us for the Australian Institute of Company Directors and Australian Cyber Security Cooperative Research Centre launch of the Cyber Security Governance Principles. I'd like to start off by acknowledging that we've had some significant technical issues this morning, so I apologise for that and hope that you're able to stay with us for the balance of this presentation. Before we formally kick off as well, I'd like to acknowledge that we're broadcasting live here from the AICd studio in Sydney on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'd like to acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders who have joined us for today. We've been overwhelmed by the response to today's event. We have almost 5,000 people registered, and I think there's many thousand already online for today's event. And we're very pleased to have with us today three esteemed panellists, which I'll introduce now. On my left, we have Rachel Falk, who is the CEO of the Cyber Security Cooperative Research Centre and was the key collaborator on the partnership we've produced to develop these principles today. Secondly, next to Rachel, we have John Mullen, who's the chair of Telstra, as well as the director on a number of other boards, including the National Maritime Museum. And last but not least, we have Melinda Conrad, who is a director of the ASX, Stockland, and the Ampol as well, amongst other board roles. So thank you for joining us, Melinda, John and Rachel. For those of you who are AICd members, this recording does actually have some director professional development points attributable to it. So you can have 5 points. You'll just need to go into your member portal and log that in manually. And the details on how to do that, the step-by-step guide, will be posted on the chat. So thank you for that, and thank you again for bearing with us while we've had some issues this afternoon. I should say as well, we have allowed around 20 minutes time at the balance for questions. Obviously we have many people online, so we'll try to group the questions and deal with them in the latter half of today's presentation. So I'm very pleased to be announcing today the launch of the Cyber Security Governance Principles, which we have been developing for around 6 months with Rachel and her team at the Cyber Cooperative Research Centre. And really the reason why we developed those principles was because we identified a gap in the market. There was much guidance for management teams and for technical experts around managing cyber risks. However, there was very few resources pitched at the board level in terms of how can boards oversight this significant risk and get more comfort and confidence that their organisation is as resilient as it could be, recognising the fluid nature of the risk and the evolution of the threats. So we know from Director Sentiment Index results, which is our twice-a-year survey, that this is the #1 issue keeping directors up at night. And so we felt that this was an area where we needed to provide guidance to the market, and we were very pleased to collaborate with Rachel and her team to develop those principles. Clearly, events over recent weeks, including the attacks on Optus and Medibank, have highlighted the risks that are out there, and in particular, the vulnerabilities of personal information to cyber attacks. And that's something which we'll explore today as part of the discussion. If you wish to tweet, I encourage you to tweet using the handle Cyber Governance and AICd and the CRC as well. So with that, I might, with no further ado, pass to Rachel to give a brief overview of the principles. Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks very much, Christian, and thanks for having me here today, and to also my esteemed panellists who also were collaborators on our principles. They do hopefully fill a bit of a gap in the market, and we have the document, I think, on the AICd website. We also have produced a handy snapshot of cyber governance principles, and I'll take you through really the areas that we carved out in the principles. Really, we divided the principles up into 5 clear areas of really what we call, I suppose, relevance and responsibilities. The first one is about setting clear roles and responsibilities across your organisation, because we realise that cyber is not just a board responsibility, but it goes right down to everyone in an organisation. In every part of the principles, we also have governance red flags, being what your organisation should be doing, but also if your organisation is not doing that, what does that actually mean? And you probably need to think about that if you see one of those behaviours in the red flags and think, my organisation doesn't do that, or what do we need to do differently? So we have set clear roles and responsibilities. This is the first chapter. We also have develop, implement and evolve a comprehensive cyber strategy. A cyber strategy is incredibly important for setting direction in your organisation, for knowing where you want to go, what your cyber posture is today, but where it should be in the future and where your vulnerabilities are. Again, identifying key digital assets, where they are, who has access, where they are across the globe, who's protecting them and how well they're protected is important. Especially in today's era of a breach, you really need to know your assets. The third chapter is embed cybersecurity in existing risk management practices. All of us involved in the cyber principles, we're really committed to the idea that cyber is just another risk. It's not special or different, but it is just another risk that has to be effectively managed amongst a suite of risks that all boards and management deal with every day. And again, there are corresponding governance red flags to help alert you should there be issues or gaps in how you're managing that. The fourth chapter is promote a culture of cyber resilience, because it's really important that you are able to recover effectively should your organisation be breached. I think the past few weeks has indicated that it's not a matter of if, it is potentially a matter of when, and all of us, no matter if we're in large ASX listed companies or we're in very small NFPs, do have to practice backups, have to practice some element of preparing for and simulating crisis responses to potentially a cyber breach of some sort. And this is really aimed at promoting that culture of cyber resilience so you can get back up and running as quickly as possible. And finally, Chapter 5 is plan for a significant cybersecurity incident. So we all agree that simulation exercises are key, that directors should proactively be involved in planning for this event, and then a clear and transparent approach to communications with all key stakeholders. And I think we all agree that that is vitally important, because it's not just how the company is communicating, it's also at the end of the day after a breach, it's how the victims also feel they understand the breach and what it means for them. And I think that's quite timely in the last few weeks. So there are the 5 parts of the principles. They're on the AICd website and will be available on the Cyber Security CRC's website from tomorrow. But we also have fantastic snapshot and also a small one-pager, I think it's one-pager, for NFPs and smaller organisations. So hopefully there is something in there for everyone.
Thanks very much, Rachel. So we might get into a little bit of panel discussion now, and I might start with Melinda on the far left. So Melinda, obviously a key part of the principles is understanding what are the key digital assets or the crown jewels of the organisation. How do you think boards can go about understanding what those assets are and how they're being managed and how they're being protected?
Sure. Thank you, Christian, and thanks for having me on the panel. I think, as Rachel's pointed out, this is a new and emerging risk or an existing risk for directors today, and it's moving incredibly quickly, as the past few weeks have shown. And in many ways, I think for regardless of the size or nature of your business, it can be quite daunting knowing where to start. And there's been a lot of discussion with the Optus and Medibank examples of data and protecting your data. But that's unique to those types of businesses. It's important to really pull back and think about what is the nature of your business and what are the important assets that you need to be protecting that either affect the operations of your business or your license to operate, i.e. your trust in your business. So for instance, if you're a manufacturing business, you need to make sure you're clear on what systems run your plants. Or if you're a retail business, what systems run your point of sale, and ensuring that you have a clarity on your crown jewels, so to speak, because that can help you prioritize what you need to focus on protecting.
Perfect, thank you, Melinda. And John, obviously a very big issue in recent times and increasingly a challenge for boards is how do they respond to a ransomware attack, which are unfortunately becoming more prevalent. So, what are your insights in terms of how your board would approach such an issue? And obviously you've talked about that experience at Toll as well from 2020, but what do you think are some of the considerations boards need to think through?
Thanks very much also for the invitation. Pleasure to be here. Look, I carry the scars of the Toll experience, which certainly taught us a lot. I think Toll was, as a large industrial company, probably sort of in the middle of the pack. I don't think we necessarily had the best cyber protection in the world, but it certainly was up there with most companies. So the first lesson we learned is pretty well everybody is vulnerable. It would be hubris to think otherwise. And I would probably divide my answer into two. And The first is dealing with the day-to-day impact, for which really you just cannot over-prepare. And so, you know, what Rachel was saying, the simulations and all, and the rest of it, I think, you know, if you think it's going to be A, it'll end up being B, and if you think it's B, it'll be A. You just have to rehearse and practice and practice. You look at the Optus and Medibank problems, they were basically taking data, but other ransomware actually stop your whole operation. So you can't actually run your day-to-day business. And trying to understand in those early days exactly what has happened is quite hard. If they've penetrated your systems, maybe they've taken data, maybe they haven't, but they've encrypted stuff. You're then in a real pickle to know what actually has happened and how to respond. And obviously clear communication of those things, which I'm sure we'll touch on in a minute. But the second perspective, which was really a wake-up call to me, was while management are fighting day to day to restore systems and get everything back up and running, if you're Toll's a $9 billion revenue business, so $750 million of revenue every month. If you can't bill, for instance, as was the case in Toll, we couldn't track and trace shipments from which you invoice customers. So your entire inbound revenue stopped, but the costs of 30, 40,000 employees keep running. So as a director, my focus switched fairly quickly to a solvency discussion. You know, if you're paying out literally hundreds of millions of dollars a week or a month, how long can you go on doing that for before any company gets into trouble? So, I mean, fortuitously, obviously, I wouldn't be here. We did manage to resolve it, but that really focused my mind then. So while we had teams working on the day-to-day, and we were also speaking with banks, with shareholders, others to make sure that we could fulfill our director's duties and keep the business solvent.
Thank you, John. Maybe Rachel, sticking with this ransomware topic, you know, what do you think your advice is to organisations in terms of how they engage with the government and what kind of support the government can provide in such an attack? And is that something where we need more support, do you think?
Well, I think irrespective of what kind of breach it is, I think the issue often when you're in an organisation and in the middle of a breach, and to John's point, you're actually not sure what it is. It could be a form of extortion, it could be a breach, it could be data theft or ransomware in the early days. You're often also, depending if you're a regulated entity, you're dealing with a lot of different regulators. In the case of a telco, you can be talking to 5 different regulators, and you'd also be informing your minister. And that can be really hard because you want to do consistent comms, and not to mention you sometimes have overseas regulators you've got to inform at the same time who also have different requirements. So it can be very difficult to also understand, you know, first principles, you know, something's happened, we've been impacted, and then moving up to we think it's this but we're not sure that. I know that government is also keen to make it clear what their expectations are, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that. But I think the challenge is often making sure there's consistent communications with all regulators and government stakeholders. And I think across the board, I've never heard that that doesn't happen. I think the challenge is what do you tell your regulators, and making sure it's uniform and consistent depending on what industry you're in, and that can be hard because you actually don't know what's happened. And I know that there's often I know it can be very challenging for customers, but at the same time, when you're in the middle of a breach, you don't know. It's sort of like, it's not like having one house that's been ransacked. Imagine a whole suburb of houses and you just don't know what's been taken from what house. And it can take some time, and you think they haven't gone there, but they have. It can take some time to really work out where they've gone and what they've taken, and that can be really hard. And I appreciate frustrating for all stakeholders involved. So I think the lesson I've learned in the past is timely, early communications of an event, and then building as you know more. But there's no perfect answer. It's very hard, to John's point. You're scrambling to keep your business afloat. You've potentially got solvency issues, and you're trying to work out in which part of the suburb have we been ransacked. I think it's very complex.
Where's the wallet going to turn up?
Yeah, where's the wallet going to turn up, exactly, and then what's going to happen. So, but I think in all cases, making sure key regulators are always informed, and your minister of the day, whoever that is informed, and their office, and you just keep on with that. And that's why you practice when it comes to simulation, because a big part of simulation exercises is the comms and stakeholder management function, and it's a very carefully staged process. And we can all talk about this in a surgical kind of very sterile environment now, but when you're in the middle of the breach, it's very, very challenging.
Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, we might stick with that theme of simulation exercises because the principles talks about that in significant detail as part of Principle 5. So what do you see as the role of the simulation exercise in terms of building that cyber resilience at the board level? And what role does the board play? And maybe I might start with Melinda before bringing in John and Rachel.
Yep. No, look, I've certainly found, I mean, this is a really complex issue that's fast moving. There's a lot of gray, and I think it's important to really accept that we're all learning on the job, right? And as directors, we need to lean in and really just take it all in as much as we can and learn from others. And I think John's been really generous in sharing his experience, and I think we need to continue to be doing that because that's how we will develop that resilience. I personally have found tremendous value in doing those simulations because, as John pointed out, when it does occur, it cuts across all of your elements of your business. It's not just IT and comms. It's legal. It's finance, and and these things take time to uncover. So the more muscle memory you can get on the simulations, the better. I think the other thing that was helpful in doing simulations where I've done them is that it helps sharpen the minds of both management and the board about what's expected in terms of communication and reporting. So sometimes there might be what's perceived to be a relatively minor event in management's eyes, but for various reasons the board would expect to be informed of that, i.e. a near miss or something like that. And so by going through the simulations, it does help both board and management get clarity about where the escalations and how they should take place.
Thanks, Melinda. John, did you want to maybe add anything?
I wholeheartedly agree with what you said. I also really liked Rachel's suburb analogy because that's exactly the issue. And again, with the toll experience, it took us some time to actually work out what had happened. Because they encrypted behind them, so we knew they'd taken things and shut things down, but they'd encrypted all our own normal tools for finding out. So then in terms of communication, you've got the dilemma of you want to communicate early and positively and definitively, but you're not 100% sure. So then do you delay to try and be more accurate and then get criticized for not communicating quickly, or do you go quickly but run the risk of actually saying something that turns out not to be the case, and then you look silly. And I think the other really big dilemma for boards, and I don't know that any of us have the answer, is in the ransom situation. And I think one can take a sort of basic view, which I do, that companies should not pay ransoms. I think it's important, but it's a big but. If you're a small enterprise and your whole livelihood depends on the business running, be like, if my child was kidnapped, would I pay the ransom? Yes, I wouldn't. To get them back safely. So I don't think anyone can take a high moral position and say there's just one rule, that's what you should do. In principle, no, you shouldn't pay, but sometimes I can really understand why small enterprises in particular would take that view.
I think as well, to that ransomware point, think through how you would respond to that situation before you're in it. So you're not making it up as you go along, and the different considerations there. So we might maybe keep exploring a little bit this issue of communications and communication with stakeholders. Because obviously when there is a big cyber incident, there's the question of the data that's been compromised, retrieving that data, getting access to it again, keeping it secure. But there's also the question of reputational damage. And John, you've talked a little bit about the challenge of responding to a fluid environment. But what's your advice to boards in terms of balancing those objectives of transparency to key stakeholders? And I'm thinking particularly customers, where it's sensitive data, as well as corporate reputation and the fact that you often don't really know exactly what's happened, and that might take a number of days or weeks to fully ascertain.
I think in the end, the truth is probably the best way to approach these things. Firstly, you don't have to remember anything, but I think people do understand that these situations are fairly fluid. What customers and other stakeholders don't appreciate is if they think you've known something and you've held it back and you haven't shared it. So I think sort of almost emphasize these are the facts as we know them today. It is moving, and we'll do our very best to keep everybody informed, up to date with the impact. And then once you do have a clearer idea, particularly if it's customer data, I think to be proactive about doing various things to try to address their particular situations. And in the Optus example, I think they're doing a number of things now. Those are the sort of be proactive rather than wait for stakeholders to pressure the company into doing things. Try and think through what needs to be done and get on the front foot.
And what do you think the role of the board or the chair is versus the management in these kind of situations in terms of communication, I mean?
Obviously, it's a shared responsibility, but I think management's main focus is to get on top of the issue and get the systems, processes and everything working again. Obviously, that doesn't absolve them from looking at things like reputation and everything else, but I think the board has got to be thinking at that level, quite apart from the solvency issue that I mentioned before, but just external reputation. One of these attacks can be absolutely devastating for your reputation as an enterprise. Employee communication, I mean, the employees are just as worried. Sometimes it's employee data that's been compromised, so it could well be them rather than external stakeholders. But I think honesty and saying, look, we don't have all the answers, we're not perfect, but we're really doing everything we can, and keep you posted.
Thank you. And so Rachel, obviously, these kinds of attacks are very hard to prepare for, but you can do what you can, and they're fluid, and the information changes, and what you might think is correct, 1 hour might be proven wrong the next hour. What's your advice to boards in terms of managing in that kind of environment and getting as much confidence as possible from the management team about what you're hearing, as well as maybe those external advisors that are also supporting?
I think to John's point, I think, it's a very fluid situation, and I think transparency at all times. In the middle of a breach, a lot's going on. You've got your management team working on it, but you've got third-party advisors. So boards often, if they sometimes want an unpolished version of the events, my advice is for the board, for the chair and the board to get the external advisors in. It's not suggesting that management's covered, but sometimes management might want to mark their own homework. And it can be that you need an unpolished version of the incident from your independent incident responders, because they will be the ones who will say, actually, we think it's this, we think this has happened, and you need to be fixing this pretty quickly. And it takes the heat from management. It's not, again, not suggesting that management is covering up, but my experience in one particular case was to get them to join together quickly, because it allows the board to actually rapid fire ask questions or for them to be informed by incident responders. So definitely my advice would be, and my other important piece of advice is always have incident responders on retainer. Is a saying, I think you don't want to be exchanging business cards in the middle of an emergency or a crisis. Companies I've been, big and small, we've always had IR, really good IR capability on retainer, because they know your business, they come in. Sometimes they might have to fly from overseas, but that's important. But it's really important the board have a channel to getting a pretty unvarnished, unpolished view of what's going on, because that informs the comms and also means that management can focus on other things. In terms of the comms, to John's point, I think going back a step, in terms of simulations too, you don't need to be crafting your own little simulation, because the world's delivering ones up all the time. We've got some great examples at the moment, and when that settles down and we exactly know what happened, it will be helpful and informative for other companies. But I think clear and timely comms, and also, again, allowing the board to get a good sense of what they want to share. Remembering listed companies also have obligations to the market, so they will be wanting a guide from their IR and their management teams around what can we tell, what's going to impact us. And again, I'm sure you both have a view on that, but to get a really good sense of where they're at in the middle of breach and where they should be and what comms, because remembering the overlay of listed company obligations. But there's no perfect, to John's, but there's no perfect formula here. But I think what I have seen in the last few weeks too is, people, I think everyone tries hard. There's always goodwill, and I don't think there's any sense of people not wanting to try hard and put information out there. I think it's just timing and which part of the suburb you're in at the right time. But really importantly, I think for the board and management to be satisfied that they have got a good handle on what's going on, or they're at least on their journey to getting to the bottom of what went on quite quickly. Remembering in the Equifax case several years ago now, took them 3 weeks to even find the server. So these things are not easy to solve quickly. So transparent, to John's point, we know something's happened, we're not sure yet, we're working through it.
Thank you, Rachel. So maybe changing tack a little bit and moving into that different part of the market, which is that SME and not-for-profit part of the membership. And this is obviously a very significant part of the director community, and that they provide many important services to Australian society. So John, putting your NFP hat on now, not your large listed hat, what are some of the simple steps you think NFPs and SMEs can take to build their own cyber security resilience?
Sure. Well, again, I carry some scars here. Personally, I have a small private foundation museum that got hacked. And one of the first lessons was I sort of relied on anonymity and obscurity. I thought, who would be interested in my little sort of thing? And of course, the lesson there was no one was specifically, but it was a machine, computer generated millions, the experts think, of attacks across the web looking for a weakness, which they found in a remote dial-up capability that we had. So that was a real lesson. So I think even though you may be an NFP or a small business, don't assume that you're not subject to all the same risk as a big company. So you should, within reason, take as many steps to protect yourself. Other lesson I learnt was there's no substitute for a physical backup. We had a server backup on another server, but they went straight through that like a knife through butter. So fortuitously, the museum manager had taken home a hard disk some while earlier, and I was fortunate because of perhaps Telstra and other things. I had some of the best experts in the world helping. And if you think they can unencrypt your data, they can't. You're in, whether you like it or not, you're very unlikely to recover. If it's in any way a sophisticated encryption attack, you're very unlikely to recover your data. So there's nothing like a physical backup. It's old-fashioned, but just to get in the drawer, and you could rebuilding when you've lost a month or a week or even a year is a hell of a lot better than if you've lost 10 or 20 years or basically all the data that the company has. So again, I think get expert help, get somebody who knows what they're doing to review your systems. You don't have to be at the same level as a huge corporate, but you've got to be a lot more sophisticated than you think you are to protect yourself.
Thank you, John. And maybe Rachel, sticking with the SME NFP sector, and obviously they're often quite resource constrained, and this is a complicated topic even for organisations with a lot of resources and staff behind them. Do you have a few kind of easy tips for where they can get started into this area?
Yeah, sure.
So the Australian Cyber Security website has some guidance for small and to medium businesses and not-for-profits around simple sort of essential 8 steps you can take. To John's point, having backups, making sure you have strong passwords, and making sure that you don't share passwords, making sure that you have multi-factor authentication on key systems, just simple things that can really make all the difference. I accept that small businesses often have really tight profit margins, but if you're running a computer or laptops or any system that is internet facing, you really do need to invest in cybersecurity. It's just like you need to invest in locks on your door, or you wouldn't dream of not having proper WHS or OHS policies. This is another risk that you really do need to pay attention to. You kind of can't skimp. You can't kind of rely on the IT guy half a day a month. That IT guy might be great, but in small not-for-profits, it's often clicking on a dodgy link, or it's really simple. So it's just making sure all staff are aware that and have regular training. There's little things that can really make a difference. It does cost money, and Microsoft have a suite of products you can upgrade to which make your mail more secure. It's not something you kind of can ignore. It is really something that for every business, large and small, really matters.
Thank you, Rachel. I should say as well, the alternative stream is not working as well as we'd like it to, so we're not able to actually receive audience questions, but we have many questions to get through.
Sure.
And there will be a recording of the event available on the website, so we apologise again for the technical problems today. So perhaps moving into a different question, which is the various different legal obligations that apply in terms of cyber security, whether it's those core directors' duties or the Critical Infrastructure Act obligations, or even the Privacy Act, which is a very important key plank of essentially cyber policy in Australia, and something which is under review at the moment. Maybe a question to stick with you, Rachel. What do you see as on the horizon in terms of cyber policies that boards need to be thinking of?
Well, obviously you've heard, I think the Attorney General Dreyfus on Friday announced stiffer penalties for data loss, I think up to 50 million. Looks like that's going to be put through, at least first reading this week, I think, in Parliament. Look, I think it's hard to say. Minister O'Neill has certainly, the Home Affairs Minister, flagged a new cyber security strategy, and you may expect to see some changes or some policies around that. I think just generally, and we sort of have addressed this through, I think, our guidance and our principles. Last year there was a best practice regulation task force, and there was questions in there to businesses around whether there should be voluntary or mandatory standards for directors and around cybersecurity risk, and we're not quite sure of the results of that yet, but I think our principles were a bit of a bid to get ahead of that and to certainly suggest here's some good voluntary guidance you might like to do. I think the SOCI Act is a really powerful piece of legislation, and I think will serve Australia's interests and certainly help strengthen businesses in the longer term. But I think the Privacy Act changes are a start, I think, in making it a bit more soberingly real, and perhaps Linda and John have something to say about that, about what they think in terms of the potential costs to organisations around a data breach, because that looks like it will really start to have teeth, and it won't be, it's not an insignificant amount now. I'm not suggesting the board's disregarded it before, but you know what I mean. Yeah.
Yeah, and I might make a reflection here as well. I think with the Privacy Act review that we're waiting the government's, the publication of that review and then the government's response. But one area that has been discussed is this question of whether consumers should have a direct right of action.
Yes.
So effectively creating a privacy action for individuals, which is not traditionally been the approach of the Australian common law or the UK common law. So that's something to keep an eye out for, I think. And, there are interesting policy questions there where is it right that there is that such a right would be provided where, and the company could be liable where they've maybe been the subject of a sophisticated attack? Is it right that there is some kind of penalty and cost associated with that versus a situation where the company has clearly not done what it needs to and has not been as vigilant as required? So anyway, we'll wait and see, and that'll be an area to keep a close eye on. So obviously, I'm sure a lot of boards and organisations feel overwhelmed by the complexity of this topic, and the fact that in every week it seems like now there's a major attack somewhere in Australia or elsewhere. And perhaps with resource constraints, they recognise that they might not have all of the in-house expertise to manage this risk as well as they'd like. So I'd like to move the conversation maybe to the role of external advice and support. So maybe, Melinda, I might bring you in. What do you think the role of external expertise is for the board and providing you with greater comfort?
I think it depends on the nature and size of the business. So if you're a small not-for-profit, you may need 100% external advice just to get a read on what systems you have and help operate your systems. In a large organization, you may have a CISO in place, and in that case, it's really about having an objective perspective on your business that can help shed light on where your vulnerabilities may be and help give direction to management who are doing the best they can. But it's about again prioritizing what is a huge issue. I think Rachel talked about particularly having external expertise in the IR component. I think it's equally as important to have it on a day-to-day basis, so that you're really just getting, and this is in a large organization, getting that objective perspective, because hopefully your IT team, no matter what their size are not saying, "I got this," right? Because I think we've all accept that you have to have a large degree of humility in this environment. And I think the more help, the better. And the reality is this is a exploding industry, and there is a talent shortage. There is a skill shortage. So making sure that you have that external expertise, you've got a relationship with that external expertise, so that you're not phoning them up in a moment of crisis when they don't know your business, they don't know how you operate. You're not going to get that same level of service.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is an issue where boards need to be trusting of the management team, but continually testing that trust and recognising that overconfidence by management is a bit of a red flag, and I think we've highlighted that in the principles as well. Maybe to bring you in here, John, is there a specific area where you think external expertise is particularly valuable to the board?
Yeah, I do. Firstly, while I think every director of a company needs to be cyber aware today, the reality is it's a very technical space, and not many directors, and I put myself in that category, could go toe to toe with a cyber expert as to how strong our defences are. So you have to, I anyway, would have to rely on experts who really know their subject matter to advise the board. And to check, like we have our financial accounts audited, why wouldn't we have our cyber resources audited in a similar way, so that as a board you can be comfortable you've taken all the steps that you can. And I think the other lesson, if you engage in penetration testing and continually not second guessing management, but getting an organisation to test it. And I know in my previous executive life, hugely embarrassing. We hired a penetration expert to come in, and the lesson that they taught me was it was mainly human behaviour. So they didn't come up with any fantastic technological wizardry that breached our firewalls. They set up a Facebook site and said they would join the IT department. And as the weeks went by, there were about 100 people in the group, and one day they asked for a password and 20 people sent the password. So then that they were in. They didn't have to breach anything. They rode up and down in the lift. They watched who's going onto the floor, tailgated somebody into the office. The young lady said to the receptionist, "I'm really sorry, I'm pregnant. I've just got to go. I've got to go to the loo." And she said, "Of course, I'll help you, sir." And then the guy tailgated somebody into the office, and he went through the office they even wrote in the report that everyone was charming. Someone made me a cup of tea while I was hacking John's computer. So all of that was human behaviour, and they pointed out all of these areas which you think you don't challenge someone in the office. Well, yes, you do. You have to challenge them, those sort of things.
And I think as well, also just being able to bring the experience of other industries and other clients as well, so you can do that benchmarking of where you sit in terms of the maturity levels. So obviously we've touched on briefly, and so maybe let's talk about a little bit more directly about this question of cyber awareness amongst directors and upskilling directors, because much like we say everyone needs to be financially literate, be able to read the accounts as a director, equally I think with cyber you need to understand this risk without pretending to be a chief digital officer, for example. So maybe I'd ask the same question to each of you, maybe starting with you, Rachel. What do you think is the best way that directors can try to upskill themselves in terms of cyber?
It's a really good question. Obviously, read our principles is one of the first things. Look, I think constantly look at the I'm also a non-executive director on board. Look at the other breaches that are going around the world, in Australia around the world, and say to your management team, could this happen to us? Get regular briefings from your, if it's not CISO, Chief Security Officer and others around just the state of the nation, the state of the world with respect to cyber breaches. There are some really good podcasts and good blogs you can sign up to as well that explain, recent breaches and hacks and sort of attacks. And to John's point, it's not just, obscure groups overseas. It can be how you can be done over, especially if you want to red team. The other thing is red teaming. Boards can call for red teams. They can call sort of to be ethically hacked, and it's quite astounding what they can learn in that process. I.e., often if you set up a rewards, say you set up a rewards program that's hauntingly similar to your organisation's rewards program, and then you send emails to people and see who clicks on links and things like that. There's lots of ways that the boards themselves can organise and do things in order to better understand the cyber risk. I think reading reports when they come out, we don't have too many judgments here in Australia, but there are a few overseas. There's a few reports overseas. I think that it's just important to understand, though, that it's really, to me, it's all about the sort of Section 1A of the Corporations Law is it's a duty, and it's sort of not dissimilar to sort of the tortious duty of care. So it's for management, boards to always ask management, what are we doing? Where do we sit with this? Always to be the point of being curious to make sure that they ask questions, and if they feel they don't understand, to ask for management to organise for, or to the chair to organise for half a day session where they can get an IR firm to come in and do a briefing. Because if you get your IR firm to come in, whoever you use, they'll pretty well scare you in a few hours. They'll have everyone on the board pretty scared when they start talking about other clients they've worked with and what they've seen and how horrific it is out there. And I'm pretty sure that'd be a good sort of upskilling for any board member. But I think, honestly, there are so many examples that we have delivered up in Australia that even at the next board meeting for both John and Melinda, I'm sure if they ask their management teams, so can any of this happen to us? That'd be just an interesting exercise. But yes, it's you don't have to cut code and don't have to be able to know ones and zeros to understand cyber risk. It's just about being curious and asking questions, and also sometimes when you get answers thinking that just doesn't sound right, it doesn't make sense to me that this would be our position, or we would be special compared to other companies, or things like that. There are small red flags, but I'm interested to hear what John and Melinda have to say about that as well.
John.
Well, I second everything you say. Spot on. Maybe just add a couple of sort of comments. One is, I think as a board you need to continually instill in management that it's not a failure to accept that we've got a weakness, and come to us, explain what it is, and then we collectively say how we're going to fix it. There's a natural temptation for people to say, no, I'm on top of my area and we're good, but it's actually not helpful at all. It's much more helpful to say this is where I think we're weak and this is where we're strong, and also to not dumb it down, but explain the issue in terms that everybody can understand. So you can sort of say, I don't know, we're at level whatever it is of the essential 8 and everything's fine. Well, what does that actually mean? So give me some practical examples as a board member. Could this have happened to us that happened over there, or that sort of thing? And then the second point, briefly, I think, would be that this whole thing transcends competition to me. So, if one of your competitors is hit, or for that matter anybody else, share the learnings. I don't think there's anything wrong with sitting together and working out how to stop this stuff happening again. And I think government has a role to play there in trying to really drive that cooperation between government and industry to ensure that every learning is passed on to others.
Thank you, John. Melinda, what's your tip?
Yeah, just to add, I think I agree with everything that's been said. Number one is making sure that everyone's aligned with the importance of this risk, right? So regardless of the size of your organization, do you have a risk register? Where does cyber sit on that? What is the collective view on what your risk appetite is for cyber, right? That would be the first point. I think the other thing too is making sure the message to everyone is that yes, this is very important, but it's also a journey. And it's going to be a bit like painting the Harbour Bridge, where you're never going to be done, and you're going to have to make choices about the resources and both time and money you allocate to this. So making sure that everyone's on the same page with how you're going to go about it. And then the other thing I would say is when you're thinking through how it's reported and how much time you spend in your board meetings, making sure it's not just something that you whip through as a one-pager. We've got this licked, we've done our pen test, we've done our phishing tests. Taking the time to really allocate it towards a board agenda, even if it's something that's a separate out of cycle session, so that everyone is aligned with how important this is, and that it's a priority, because it's not going away.
Thank you, Linda. So I thought we might touch on a topic which is generating a bit of debate, which is around the role and the value maybe of cyber insurance. And maybe, Rachel, I'll direct this question to you. There's been a lot of discussion around whether cyber insurance is offering value for money, whether there's exclusions that mean you can't actually access the policy, for example, because it might be something which is a state-sponsored attack. The value perhaps being not in the policy, but the access to expertise during an incident. What's your reflections on that?
Well, at the Cyber Security CRC, we did write a paper on this last year, and that's available on our website on cyber insurance. Look, my views on cyber insurance are it's a good product if it's part of a suite of products you have to manage your cybersecurity risk. Don't over-rely. I mean, you should know your environment. You should really, you should know it already. You should have done an audit. It's not a substitute for that. It is good in terms of if you want to mitigate some of the risk around mop-up, around remediation, and around certainly theft. In some policies pay for a ransom, the actual ransom amount that you pay. I think in terms of the comment around access to advisors, there's no reason you need insurance to not. You should be able to always engage an IR provider, lawyers, and breach coaches or whatever they're called if you really feel that's necessary. But I think you have to go into it with your eyes wide open, because it's going to get it's a very, very new product. It's not a mature insurance product in that sense. The premiums are changing, and in some cases it will be harder to get cyber insurance coverage depending on your level of risk. But I think it's something that you don't go in thinking this is your silver bullet to mitigate cyber risk. It's one of the things you do in addition to looking whether you've had your pen testing done, have you got your all your other mitigations in place, and then cyber insurance is a nice to have. But I have to stress, you don't need access. You don't need to buy cyber insurance to have access to incident response capability or good lawyers. They're all available, and you should have those anyway. But it is certainly something. But I will add that it is also important that organisations buy cyber insurance, understanding what it means to get it and what will happen in the event of a breach. Sometimes the insurers will act with you, but they can make decisions that the company has to be comfortable with as well. So it's just about understanding what coverage you're getting. And I have to say that often the checklists that you're asked to fill out, the questions you have to really think about, and we're a small organisation, I'd like to think we sort of know what we are doing, and you really do have to carefully consider. And so for a large organisation, you also have to consider those questions, because you've got to understand that that's upon which, you have to break down the answers, because that's the duty of disclosure and things like that. So it's certainly worth looking at as part of a suite of products.
Yeah, certainly. That's some of the feedback I've heard, is that the process of even applying for the insurance and going through that questionnaire might actually reveal some vulnerabilities.
Definitely, and that's helpful.
You can address.
Yeah, and very helpful. And I think it made us pause too when we went through it the first time. Do we have that, or what does that mean? So I definitely think there's a role to play with insurers. Could be also helping organisations understand a bit like, we won't insure your house because you haven't got the deadlocks we want, but if you got those deadlocks and you did that, we would provide you with insurance. So I do think there's a role that they could be playing, an uplift around helping you become more cyber secure.
Yeah. John, did you have anything you want to add on that point?
No, again, I think you've enunciated it really well. I think it's a bit like increasing penalties. Yes, obviously, if a company is really deficient, and it should be fined, but actually the cost to the company of having a successful cyber attack is a lot worse than a penalty. And likewise with insurance, the damage done to the company, insurance is never going to recover everything. I mean, it may cover certain specific, clearly identifiable risks, but the reputational damage, those sort of impacts, they're uninsurable. And I think, to Rachel's point, it's going to get more and more expensive, more and more difficult to obtain, and they're going to put more and more restrictions, already sort of taking out sovereign, back. And it's such a nebulous area. How do you actually prove whether it was a sovereign state attack or it was just a random? So you end up arguing and debating with insurers, and a claim can take years. So I think, exactly as Rachel said, I would have it in the suite of things, but don't rely on it to absolve you from all the other responsibilities.
Thank you, John. So we're running out of time. So I was thinking, how do I summarise the discussion? And probably the best way is to maybe come back to the 5 principles that we've developed, and which John and Melinda have helped us produce in collaboration with Rachel. And, those 5 principles are: 1, set clear roles and responsibilities. So does the management team and the board know what their respective roles are? 2, develop, implement and evolve a comprehensive cyber strategy. And that's really about making sure you don't have a set and forget approach to this risk, given how quickly it's moving. 3rd, embed cyber security in existing risk management practices. So of course, this is a new risk in some ways. However, existing risk management practices have developed and evolved with lots of new risks. So do not see it as entirely unique proposition. The fourth, promote a cyber resilient culture, and that really should be from the boardroom down. And part of that is making sure that boards are lifting their own skill levels, but also that that is being projected throughout the organisation and throughout the senior management team. Cyber is a priority for everyone, from the chair all the way down to the most junior employee. And key to that is training and testing and benchmarking yourself against others. And the fifth, which we don't want to say, but it is important to say, is plan for a significant cyber incident. Continually plan, continually iterate your response. Do not be responding on the fly. There are many different scenarios you can walk through in advance that, all things going well, you won't have to deal with, but you'll be sure as hell happy if you've gone through it beforehand. And make sure, as part of that, that stakeholder communications are key, particularly with those whose your reputation most lies with, which is often your customer base. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. Again, I'd like to apologise for the technical difficulties we've had on the LinkedIn platform. We hoped you would have had a better experience than that. Recording of the event will be available on our website. And as I said, there are documents available on the website, which is the full cybersecurity principles we've developed, as well as a brief snapshot document and a checklist for NFP and SME directors that you can really hopefully pick up straight away and implement. So with that, I'd like to say thank you for joining us today and thank our panellists, Rachel Falk, John Mullen and Melinda Conrad. Thank you. Thank you and have a great afternoon.